Greetings all, and welcome to lucasprues. In this video we're going to be building not one, but two Shermans. The 1975 Italeri reissue of the Esci M4A1 Sherman, and the 2006 Trumpeter M4A3 76 Sherman. And we'll be swapping the turrets and hulls around to make a model of both Old Phyllis and Murder Inc. from the movie Fury. Now, I know those of you are going to point out that Murder Inc. is in fact an M4A4, so using the hull from the Trumpeter kit and the turret from the Italeri kit is going to be wrong. However, the Americans never really used the M4A4. It seems that it was only used by the British and a few others under Lend-Lease. So technically it's more accurate for Murder Inc. to be an M4A3. So I've already given the kits a little wash in some warm soapy water to remove any of the oil and residue that gets on them from the moulding process. So without further ado, let's get into building them. I decided to begin with the M4A1 hull. Like most kits of the time, the lower hull requires a little bit of assembly, which involved cutting out the side plates as well as a lower hull piece, and after giving them a quick cleanup, gluing them to assemble the lower hull structure. I did have to do a little bit of sanding to remove the excess sprue and some of the imperfections, but there wasn't too much, and they glued together quite nicely. Unusually, the Italeri Sherman comes with a little bit of an interior for the hull. It's pretty basic, but I still decided to assemble it. There's a few pieces that make up the giant radial engine that goes at the back, along with a little bit of a floor section for where the gunner is, a gearbox cover, and also the drive shafts themselves. I first assembled the engine parts and then cut out the rear armoured plate and sanded it down, and then I cut out the floor, the transmission cover and the gearboxes and glued them all into place. The rear plate and all of the interior parts went together really quite nicely. I think it's a bit of a shame they didn't do more detail, especially inside of the turret, since there's no turret basket or cannon breech or even seats for any of the crew members, but it's still nice they had the engine since it's such an iconic feature in the Sherman. The next part that I attempted to assemble was the front transmission cover for the outside of the vehicle. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to fit. It seemed a little bit too large, so I had to try and cut it down. Even after consulting the instructions to make sure I was definitely putting it in the right way, it just wouldn't fit. In the end, I had to use my side cutters to cut away the excess at the top, and then it finally did fit. However, there was quite a large gap between the upper hull and the lower hull. Fortunately though, there would be some stowage at the front, so I didn't bother with sanding and filling. All of the hatches for both the crew and the engine deck come as separate parts on the Italeri Sherman, which I think is a pretty cool feature since it means you can have them opened up and see all the details inside. I decided to use blue tack to hold them in place so that I could open them at a later date, and at this stage I also glued in a spare machine gun to replace the rather basic one that was included in the kit for the bow gunner. Since Old Phyllis has an early 76 turret, I chose that one from the Trumpeter set, which includes both the early and late 76 turret, and then began to adjust the size of the turret ring so that the turret would fit into the Italeri Sherman's chassis. After a bit of cutting and sanding, I got a nice fit with the turret ring, so then began to assemble the rest of the turret. There are separate hatches for both the commander and also the gunner, and there's also options for a 50 and a 30 cal on the roof. I went with the single 50 cal as appropriate for Old Phyllis, and then I glued the turret roof to the base and chose the appropriate early Sherman mantlet and gun without the muzzle brake and glued them into place. Next came the Sherman's running gear, which is a little bit complicated in the Italeri set. There's also some very fragile parts that tend to break where you joined the row wheels to the actual suspension bogies, so be very careful when assembling them. I managed to get all 6 bogies assembled and attached to the hull using the magic of editing, and then I glued the sprocket wheels together and the idler wheel and attached them to the hull. There were quite a lot of other accessories to still add to the Italeri Sherman, but at this stage I decided to take a quick break and work on the Trumpeter kit to assemble Murder Inc. The Trumpeter Sherman is a little bit more simple for the hull assembly, which only requires the rear plate to be joined to the lower hull, and then you can attach the upper hull. However, the upper hull has quite a fair bit of detail to be added. Even with all of the hatches moulded to the hull and in the shut position, there's still quite a lot of extra little parts to add to the hull. These include the tail and the front lights, some little exhausts and extra details around the engine deck, the bog machine gun, and also the travel lock for the main 75mm. There's also some additional radiators for the engine that have to be installed to the upper hull, and then you can add the upper hull to the lower hull and install the turret. The Italeri turret, unlike the Trumpeter turret, was too small for the turret ring in the Trumpeter hull, so I had to glue some extra pieces of plastic on to make it a little bit of a tighter fit. Once I'd fixed this, I then started to assemble the cannon. The cannon on the Italeri Sherman is a lot more complicated, with a small part that fits into a sleeve, which you then glue the mantlet to, followed by the cannon barrel and an extra piece for the end of the barrel, which includes a hole. I then glued it to the turret and began to add some of the other accessories, such as the small hatch for throwing out the spent shells, and the commander and the gunner's hatch. There's also a 50 cal included, which I glued on since Murder Inc. has one, and a searchlight for the middle of the turret. Once the turret was done, I then began to assemble the running gear. Much like the Italeri Sherman, there was a bit of assembly required for some of the wheels. The sprocket comes as 2 pieces, which you then glue to the hull, and the idler comes as 1. The bogies themselves have 2 different style options, one with some slightly earlier wheels, and another that has a little bit more of a simplified pattern. The earlier bogies require the assembly of the wheels and 2 halves of the bogie, which is a little bit similar to the Italeri one, and the other more simplified bogies come as a single piece. I decided to install a mix of them to make it look like the Sherman had had a few of its wheels replaced over time. Before painting, I attached the last of the accessories onto the Italeri Sherman hull, which included a travel lock for the gun, the various lights for both the front and the rear of the tank. I was going to replace the basic plastic molded parts that were representing the lifting hooks, but I forgot to do this before painting, but as you'll see a bit later, I correct this. Speaking of painting, for both of the Shermans, I begin with 2 coats of Tamiya's XF62 Olive Drab, applied using a brush mixed with a little bit of water to help thin the paints down. The key with brush painting is to build up the paint in several layers to help make sure that you get a nice uniform finish that's nice and smooth. You'll notice just how thin my coats are, especially with the white Trumpeter turret, which you can still see the colour of the plastic underneath until at least the second coat of paint. Another trick is to try and apply the paint in the same direction with the brush as much as possible. I usually try to make all of my layers go from the front of the tank to the rear, although in some cases such as around the wheels and some of the finer details, it's okay to change direction a bit to get the paint in between some of the trickier areas. It was only after I'd done the second coat of Olive Drab on both Old Phyllis and Murder Inc. that I realised I'd forgot to replace the basic plastic lifting hooks. To do this though is relatively simple. I basically get my sprue cutters out and remove the old plastic ones, and using a little bit of bent metal I bend it to a circular shape and glue it into place using some Deluxe Materials Odourless Rocket CA glue. It's quite a simple modification, but I think it adds quite a lot of character and extra detail to the Sherman tank. For the last 2 coats of the base colour, I decided to switch to Vallejo's 70887 US Olive Drab, which is a little bit of a lighter and more drabish kind of colour, which I think is more accurate for the American tanks. I apply it in the same fashion I did with the Tamiya, since it's also a water-based acrylic, only I have to squeeze it out of the bottle onto a little piece of cardboard, since it's not a larger bowl like the Tamiya paints. I decided to start painting the tracks after painting the final coat of Olive Drab, and I proceeded to make the mistake of painting all of the tracks on the Sherman's XF16 flat aluminium when it should only be the sides, since they had rubber padding in the centre of the track. What can I say? I guess I do too many German and Soviet vehicles with full steel tracks. I also paint the tools, the spare track links from a spare Airfix kit, and also the machine gun with the flat aluminium. Next, I add the decals for the front of the cannons. I decided to print out some custom ones rather than trying to hand paint the text Old Phyllis and Murder Inc. on the gun barrels. To apply the decals, I used the usual technique of sticking them in some water, then sliding them carefully onto the model, adjusting them with a sharp cocktail stick, and then applying some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them conform to the gun barrel and its curves. I then touch up with some Olive Drab around the edges of the decal where the ink started to chip away due to the lower quality of my custom decals, before I then used some Rocket CA glue to glue the logs onto the sides. For the logs, I found a few sticks in the garden and then cut them to shape. With the logs in place, I could then add the black pattern that's applied onto all of the tanks. For this, I used some Vallejo flat black and using a fine brush mixed the paint with a little bit of water to make it nice and thin, and then applied it in the shapes I wanted and over the logs. I only did one coat of the black camouflage because I wanted it to be a little bit of a lighter coat, and black being such a dark colour doesn't really need too many layers before it becomes nice and solid. While I had the black out, I also painted some parts of the machine gun, the rubber on the road wheels, and also corrected my full metal tracks so that they had black on the rubber areas. I gave the black a chance to dry, and while doing so I painted the machine gun ammunition olive drab, and then it was time for a bit of weathering. To start off with, I painted some metal chipping and scratches using some XF16 flat aluminium and a fine brush to dab the paint onto some of the areas that are more prone to getting scratched or damaged. These included the edges of hatches and on wheels, the corners of armoured panels which are more exposed to getting scraped by things like branches or debris as the tank is driving along, and a few other little marks on some areas to create the effects of some battle damage or other scratches. I like to go a little bit overboard with the metal chipping, and once the metal has dried, then paint black and olive drab back over some of the scratches to create a bit more of a depth effect that makes it look like the paint was peeled off of the flat aluminium rather than I've dabbed flat aluminium over the painted surface. Once I'd softened the metal chipping effect, I then painted the tools a second coat of flat aluminium and also a little bit of flat earth to paint some of the wooden parts. After that, I then repainted the old Phyllis and Murder Ink text using a little bit of Vallejo yellow. This was just to neaten it up a little bit and remove some of the scratches that had occurred due to the lower quality of the decals. Next, both of the Shermans received a coat of Tamiya Panaline Ascent. This enamel pin wash will flow into all of the gaps, helping to highlight details, and will darken the model overall. It also gives the tank a bit more of a dirty, grungy effect and helps to blend the paint job. After I've applied it over both tanks, I then get out some Tamiya X20 enamel thinners and using a cotton tip, rub away the excess from some of the larger areas, which will help make the tank a little bit lighter and help it flow more into the details, making them a little bit more highlighted. One of the advantages of hand painting with acrylics is that you can then use these enamel thinners really easily to help create these kind of weathering effects. I let the enamel wash dry for a couple of hours before then getting out some Vallejo mud and grass effects. I then use a cocktail stick to apply this weathering effect onto the lower part of the hull and also on the side skirts to create a build-up of grass and mud as the tank has been driving off-road. I also mix it with a little bit of water to help it flow in between the bogies. With the lower parts of both Shermans sufficiently weathered, I then moved on to adding the stowage on the turret and the upper hull. For both tanks, I use a little bit of balsa wood to make the shelf at the front of the tank, and various other materials such as spare parts from the Airfix Firefly, as well as some spare stowage from a plastic soldier's kit, some spare bits of sprue to create the American helmets, as well as a few spare German ones I had, and some bits of tissue and cardboard to create various other things such as the cardboard boxes, and by mixing the tissue with a bit of water and some PVA glue, I could roll them into shapes to create various bags and rolled up tents. I glued the cardboard and tissue accessories using some regular PVA glue, while normal polycement was used to glue some of the plastic parts such as the bags, the jerry cans, and the spare sprue helmets on the sides of the tank. Overall, both tanks had pretty similar storage, although Old Phyllis notably had a German helmet on one of the front headlights, as well as a couple of spare bits of 50 and 30 cal ammunition on the front shelf. It also had a few extra jerry cans, including one on the left side of the turret. Murder Ink was pretty similar with its stowage at the rear and on the sides of the turret, but it did noticeably have a spare road wheel and also some spare track links mounted on the front. Once the stowage is in place, I begin to paint it. I used quite a large number of colours to paint them, including Vallejo 70872 Chocolate Brown, 70921 English Uniform Brown, Tamiya XF51 Khaki Drab, and Tamiya XF52 Flat Earth for the various bits of canvas, bag and fabric. Then I also used 70983 Vallejo's Flat Earth for painting the wood at the front of the tank, Vallejo 70909 Vermilion Red for the red tarpaulin that's on the back of all the tanks, XF62 Olive Drab to paint the spare fuel tanks, XF9 Hull Red to paint the leather straps on some of the bags, XF63 German Grey to paint the German helmet, and Vallejo 70951 White for some of the markings on the spare jerry cans. I paint the vision blocks on old Phyllis's Cupola X1 Gloss Black to give them a shiny glass-like appearance, and then I painted all of the lights, including the tail lights for the vehicle 70997 Silver from Vallejo. I used a small brush to apply some XF16 flat aluminium chipping to the jerry cans and spare helmets on all of the tanks, before then getting some Tamiya X27 clear red and painting the convoy lights at the back of both of the Shermans. I then decided to install the tracks for both of the tanks. I prefer to staple together rubber band tracks, although I have heard some people don't mind trying to solder them together or possibly use the heat of a needle to melt them. After I've stapled the tracks together, I use a knife to remove some of the excess mud and grass effects from the upper surface of the bogies, and then try to gently stretch the track into place. Although the Italeri kit included the option for plastic tracks, all my other Shermans have rubber band ones, so I decided to just stick with it. Fortunately, none of the tanks had any damage to their running gear when I installed the tracks, even though they were quite tight. Old Phyllis has a bit of netting holding some of the rear stowage on the back of the tank, so to create this, I tore apart a few pieces of compression bandage and used a bit of super glue to glue them to the back of the tank. I created a bit of a netting effect by layering two pieces, and once it had dried, I then painted the netting XF52 flat earth by gently dabbing it over the surface of the compression bandage. I also dabbed a bit of XF52 that had been thinned with water over the running gear to make it a little bit lighter than the mud and grass effects had already made it, and then I dabbed a little bit of extra down the side. For some further dirt weathering, I got out some Tamiya weathering powders and used the black powder to add a bit of gun smoke and exhaust streaks, and the rust powder to create a pretty heavy coat over the entire of the tank and the turret. After I'd applied the coat, I then used a damp cotton tip to wipe away the excess to soften the dirt effect and help it build up in the cracks, and after doing this, both Old Phyllis and Murder Inc. were finally completed. After having built both the Italeri M4A1 and the Trumpeter M4A3 76 in somewhat of a kit bashing fashion, I have to say both of these kits I really think are quite fantastic, and I definitely recommend them. They're both around about the 20 to 25 AUD price range, so that's pretty decent for a 76 scale tank of this kind of detail, and on the whole they have some nice options. I think it's a bit of a shame the Italeri Sherman doesn't have more interior parts, especially a cannon breech for the turret, but it's still pretty cool that you get the engine, and I think it's awesome to have that kind of detail in a tank. I think it really gives you an appreciation for how complicated these vehicles are, and I would like to see more kits have interiors. And speaking of interiors, I will eventually 3D print some interiors, or at least that's the plan for both these Shermans. However, that won't be for quite some time, and it will also be in a separate video. I also have a fair few crew figures from various US Army tanker sets in 1/72nd scale, so if you want to see me attempt to paint these, let me know, because I may do a video on that as well in the future. And obviously, given the fact that I have all these crew figures and the Shermans from 1st Platoon, there will probably be some Fury stop motions in the future to look forward to. The other issue I had with the Italeri Sherman was the transmission cover fitting very, very poorly to the front of the vehicle. Again, that might have just been me, I might have done something wrong, but it seems to me more likely that it's not very well designed. The Trumpeter kit is definitely a bit more easy, although it's still a bit annoying that it comes with old rubber band tracks. It's cool that the Italeri comes with the option to have the hard plastic tracks. I would have gone with it, but I decided to just keep it all a bit more uniform and do the rubber band tracks anyways. Compared with the other three Shermans that I've built so far, I would have to say you can definitely see some improvement over the years. The oldest, both tooling wise and in terms of build date, would be Lucy Sue, which is the old 1963 M4 Sherman from Airfix. Now, you'll have to be a little bit forgiving because I did this kit back in 2018, so it was amongst the first tanks that I ever did. I probably wouldn't do the Airfix Sherman again just because it's 1/76 scale, which is a bit too small, and there was quite a lot of flash and cleanup necessary and a few parts that didn't fit very nice. The next two Shermans I did were the 1974 tooling Hasegawa Easy 8 Sherman, and although they're quite a lot of fun to build, they are much too big to be 1/72nd scale, and you can kind of see when they're compared to the other tanks. I did a video of making Fury, although it's not as comprehensive and as detailed as this one, but you can still get a general idea of how I built it. I also did a scratch built interior out of cardboard and bits of clay and metal wiring, which was a bit of a challenge but a lot of fun. I would have to say the Trumpeter kits are probably the best Shermans out of all of these ones, given that they have a quite large range of the different types, and they also seem to be the best engineered, that fit really well together and have some pretty nice detail and a few different storage options. Although that being said, I really do like the old Esci kits, and even though the M4A1's front transmission cover didn't fit, I still found it one of the funnest and the most detailed of all the kits. So, on that note, may the debate for the best brand of 1/72nd scale Sherman rage in the comments section down below. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like. And if you want to see more of my inbox reviews, build videos, animations, and 3D printing shenanigans, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the products that I use. I'd also like to give a little shout out to my local hobby shop, Tectonic Hobbies, where I bought both of these kits. It's a good little store to go to. And yeah, thanks again, and until the next video, take care, and as always, model on.